argue that this answers the question that a lot of people ask me. A lot of people ask me this question, and this was also one that was written, and I interspersed these in this sermon. Somebody asked the question, will we know each other in heaven? Good question. This passage, at least in my estimation, Revelation chapter 6, answers that question in the affirmative. Because they knew who they were, they knew how their life had been, and they knew how they died. In fact, in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus said, and I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and talking about in heaven, and will sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So there must be some concept of the identity. He said, when you're in heaven, you're going to come from the east and from the west, and you're going to sit down and sup with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. How could you do that if we are just nameless faces? How could you do that if you have no identity? Oh, well, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob get to keep theirs, but you don't get to keep yours. That's not right. We'll know who the big names are. Right? No. Our identity is part of who we are. We will be sinless. I believe there is a part of us, a very big part of us, that will not go into eternity. That part that still fights the battle with sin. But that does not mean that we won't know who we are. In fact, this question of knowing what happens to ourselves, that often comes from people in this fashion. This is almost universally how it's asked of me. Pastor, if my best friend, child, spouse, whatever, best friend, child, spouse dies, doesn't go to heaven, and I go to heaven, am I going to be sad forever because they're not with me? That's how the question comes. If I go to heaven and my spouse, best friend, child, whatever, doesn't make it to heaven, am I going to be sad forever? This is how I would answer that. And I want you to, before you think, well, that seems too easy, really think on how I'm about to answer this. Ask this question. Is God unhappy for eternity? No. Has God forgotten anybody? No. Is God sitting up in heaven going, oh, man? No. So maybe instead of forgetting someone, perhaps we will be so clear of our sinful thinking that we will actually be able to understand the righteousness of God to the point that we understand why a rebel is in hell. I don't know how that is, because right now my mind can't necessarily receive it. But maybe there will be such a change in my understanding of righteousness that I will understand God's wrath. Because God's not unhappy. God's not going to spend eternity sad. And neither will you. One last question I want to answer, and it's very short. But I get it a lot, and I got it written down. How is resurrection affected by someone being cremated? I felt like this would be a good time to answer that question. Because we just talked about the glorified body and the raising up. And I can't tell you, I've done more funerals than I care to remember. I've performed funerals for many friends and relatives, and this question comes up a lot. Cremation in Scripture is neither encouraged nor is it discouraged, because it is not referred to in Scripture except in this instance. The burning of bodies in a ritualistic fashion was done in pagan societies. That's the only time you're going to find the act of cremation. As a ritual, it was used in certain pagan societies. However, burying of bodies is the tradition among the Judeo-Christian history. And the reason why burial was the tradition was because of the belief in the resurrection of the body. However, let me add a side note. Cremation doesn't do anything more to the body than what natural processes of decay does to the body, except it expedites it. If you take somebody who was buried 2,000 years ago, they're dust unless they were well preserved. And if a person is cremated, it cannot. Number one, it can't affect their soul in their resurrection, because that was determined before they died. That relationship with Jesus Christ through regeneration was formed before death. Had a pastor one time who was adamant with me that he was not a pastor in the Christian church, he was from the Orthodox church, but he came and he was adamant that because one of the families in the church wanted to have the family cremated, that they were condemning his soul to hell. I said, how? His soul isn't even there anymore. But I know some of you had questions about that, and I wanted to answer it. Cremation is an expedited way to do what nature is going to do anyway, and that is bring the body back to ashes and dust. When the resurrection occurs, God is not going to be wondering where your body is. God is not going to be wondering where the molecules of the pieces of your body is. God is not going to be concerned about that. Because God, if He knows every hair on my head, I'm sure He knows every molecule of my body. And He can make a body, He can make a new body any way He chooses. But just to answer that question as simply as I know how, the Bible does not condemn it, nor does it encourage it. And I believe Romans 14 leaves things such as that to our conscience.